going to start with the principles of stated preference, and then we're going to talk at length about contingent valuation and a little bit less about choice modeling. Essentially what you do with stated preference methods is that you, like with revealed preferences, you're trying to infer preferences for environmental goods from reports of intended behavior in hypothetical markets. So we're not looking at actual behavior, but we're essentially asking people, what would you do if, right? And that creates all sorts of possibilities, and it also creates all sorts of problems. And we're going to talk about those at length. These methods comes in two flavors. The oldest one is contingent valuation, where essentially you ask the question, how much are you willing to pay for this box of cornflakes? Right? That is essentially the question. Although typically it is about a product that is less familiar to you than a box of cornflakes. The other method is choice modeling or choice experiments, where essentially it's again hypothetical, but perhaps more familiar. You ask people to choose between options. And that is indeed what you would do in the supermarket. Nobody in the supermarket ever asks you, what would you pay for this box of cornflakes? Instead, you go to the aisle where the cornflakes are, and you pick between the boxes that are on offer, right? That is what you do, which come in different sizes, different shapes, different colors, and different prices, as well as different contents. Sometimes called choice modeling, it's sometimes called choice experiments. It's also known, particularly in transport and among marketeers, it's known as conjoint analysis. It's all the same thing. My computer does not want to play today. Okay. As I said, stated preferences opens up all sorts of possibilities. The main one is that with revealed preference we can only look at direct use. If I observe you going to the beach, that is not because you think your grandchildren will go to that beach one day, right? That is not because you think there's potential for a bar on the beach, right? You go to the beach to directly enjoy the sunshine and the water and perhaps a ball game, right? That is why you go to the beach. And that is what I observe when I use the travel cost method. I observe your direct use value of the beach. 2 weeks ago we talked about total economic value and all the other things that are included there. Stated preference methods allow you to probe bequest values and option values and existence values and so on and so forth, right? Things that should not directly influence your behavior, but may reflect your values, right? So that is one of the main strengths of these methods. We're not talking about an actual market, we're talking about a hypothetical market, so we do not need to make assumptions about market structure. We do not need to worry about the availability of data. This is data collection, right? We go in and directly collect people's preferences or people's statements about their preferences, and we can apply it to markets that may come into existence in the future but do not yet, right? So we can essentially do it about anything and everything. And the example given here is novel goods. I've also seen contingent valuation studies about the existence or the value that people attach to mythical creatures such as fairies and trolls, right? Which you can never observe in a real market because these things don't exist. but you can still ask people about their valuation. Because we are directly asking people, we can also ask them other things. Some of them are obvious: gender, income, education, but we can also probe why they gave a particular answer. It's not something that you typically see in a travel cost study, definitely not something you would see in Dynamic pricing, right? If you rely on Zoopla or Rightmove to look at house prices, then what you have is the house price, and you have something about the quality of the house, but you don't know anything about the buyer, right? You have very little information there. Because here in these methods we are interviewing people, you can ask them questions. Why did you bid £100, right? Policymakers tend to like these studies because it is in many ways very similar to polls, political polls. Who would you vote for in the next election? So it is something that they're very used to seeing, right? And that Nicholas, I'm not, you guys did not see that, right? Nicholas wanted a live transcription. Fine, it doesn't help, right? It just picks up all the unimportant words and garbles the important words. But good luck with that. See, garbles became gargoyles. Okay. Computer is working still. There's also real weaknesses. To get it right, you're talking about a very substantial investment. So revealed preference methods is something that an advanced PhD student could do in a year. So you're talking about £50,000 or so would be the cost for a revealed preference study. Stated preferences, 150,000 is sort of the lower limit. This is expensive. It's also time consuming to set it up correctly. So this is not cheap. The biggest weakness, however, is that it's not rooted in actual behavior. You're asking people what they would do if. And that creates all sorts of biases. You essentially make 3 leaps of faith. First, with stated preferences, we're looking at actual behavior in an actual market. We make 3 leaps of faith. First, we replace actual behavior with intended behavior. But people don't always live up to their intentions. People actually may have very distorted views of themselves. So there's a leap of faith that what people say they do is the same as what they actually do. And there's been marketing surveys where they interviewed people in the parking lot of a big supermarket and asked them, when they go in, are you going to buy toilet paper, yes or no, and how much are you willing to pay for toilet paper? And then they also interviewed people coming out of the supermarket. Did you just buy toilet paper, and how much did you pay for it? And people just get the answer completely wrong, even though 5 minutes ago they paid for their toilet paper. They just have no clue whatsoever about this. Or they may not be willing to say, right, that they bought the cheapest toilet paper there was, or the most expensive one with perfume and nice flowers on. They will not admit they may not want to admit to what they really done, or they may have just forgotten already, even though they did so 5 minutes ago. So the real gap between actual and intended behavior. Then the second leap of faith is that the hypothetical market somewhat resembles the real market that could be out there. In some cases, I gave you the example before that we're talking about willingness to pay to protect fairies. It will never be a real market, right? I think, because I don't believe that fairies exist. And then the third leap of faith is that what people say they would do is the same as what they think they would do. That people tell you the truth, and they may not, either because they do not know the truth or because they are not willing to tell you their truth, right? This is very big stuff in environmental economics. This is what occupies a large number of my colleagues full time. So let's look a little bit deeper into contingent valuation. How would you do this? And the key question in contingent valuation is, what would you pay for this good? Right? That is the central question, but you actually need to do much more than that. So this is a step-by-step guide to how you would do a contingent valuation study. First, you need to get your act together, know what you're talking about, right? So you guys are now all writing about antibiotics, and some of you have submitted already. You would need to get your head around, why do we worry about antibiotics? Where do they come from? Where do they end up? What sort of impacts would they have in the environment? All those things you would need to set straight, because you're going to ask questions about how much are you prepared to pay more for antibiotic-free milk, right? For instance. And you need to be realistic about this. You need to tell the people you're interviewing why. Most people don't even know about antibiotics and its relationship to milk, right? Most people know about antibiotics, but most people know about milk, but few people would actually be able to make the connection between the two. And then you need to make decisions about how you're going to do it. Are you going to survey people by telephone or in the internet or face to face? Going to knock on the door or stand near a big shop? You need to make decisions about which population are my interviewees drawn from, and then you need to decide on a sampling strategy to be hopefully representative of the population that you're interested in, right? Then you design a survey, which is time consuming to do that right. The order of the questions, the exact questions, the formulation of the questions. Then step 4, you actually need to pre-test. The big problem with academics designing surveys is that academics are very strange people, completely unrepresentative, using words that nobody understands, right? Using formulations that just confuses people. You need to get all that stuff out. And of course, the question that is in your head needs to be the question that people read, right? So you may assume all sorts of things when you think of a question, because it's obvious from the context what you mean, right? And it's obvious from all the things that are in your head that you know what you mean. But of course, what matters is that the people who read this cold know what you're asking, right? So you really need to pre-test and typically completely redesign your survey, right? And those pre-tests would be in focus groups, where essentially you ask people to take this survey while you're there and just talk about, this is what I'm thinking that the question really means. You need to get that feedback, and of course you need to interview people afterwards. What went through your head when you read this question, right? And that typically then means that you need to completely redesign your questionnaire. And it would be good to do a few iterations here. If you're gonna do a field interview, either on the phone or with live interviewers face to face, then you need to hire and train interviewers. You need to do a field pilot test again, and probably that means you need to redesign. Then, and now we're typically a year into the study, you actually need to put it in the field. You need to quality control, you need to enter your data, you need to analyze the data and test and test and test and test, and then finally you're ready to aggregate the results, take an average or a total, and start writing and presenting, and present it either to an academic journal or to the intended audience, which is typically some policymaker, right? Now, what does the survey actually consist of? This is a recommended order, but it sometimes comes in a different order. You start with actually telling your interviewees what you are talking about. We are talking about antibiotics that are prophylactically used in agriculture, right? Completely wrong, right? Few people understand the word prophylactic, right? I probably mispronounce it. People don't call agriculture agriculture, they're thinking about farms, right? And so on and so forth. Just describe what the thing is about. Then you may ask some general questions about this. How much did you know about this problem beforehand? And do you have strong opinions about this already? Attitudes towards the environment in general. Do you vote Green? Do you vote Tory? That sort of stuff. Are you a vegan? Those sort of questions are important if you are talking about antibiotics in milk, right? Then you need to describe some sort of policy intervention, because asking people what do you think about is just not very helpful. The question would be, are you prepared to pay 10 pence more for a liter of milk if it is produced without antibiotics? That would be the question that you could ask, right? And that's a very specific question. So you need to describe the current situation. Antibiotics are essentially unregulated in agriculture at the moment. And then you would need to describe a proposed situation. We're going to raise the price of milk, and we're going to use the proceeds to clean up or reduce the dumping of antibiotics in surface waters, right? You need to describe that, and you need to describe that in ways that relate to people and that they actually understand it. And then you need to ask them, so how much are you willing to pay extra for the proposed situation? You need to decide on the payment vehicle and the elicitation mechanism. I'll get back to those. And then you need to do follow-up questions. You said 10p, why did you not say 15? Why did you say 0? Is it because you object to something in what we said? Or you said you're willing to pay 100 or 10 pounds for a liter of milk. Are you absolutely sure that that is how much you can afford, right? And so on and so forth. Did you actually think about what is the price of milk, right? And if it goes now, it's 180 for 4 pints, right? So if you're saying that you're willing to pay 10 pounds for the liter of milk, are you sure you got your numbers right? So you need to ask follow-up questions just to see why people came up with that. And then typically at the very end, age, gender, income, education, family size, and so on and so forth. The reason that you put this at the end is that some people stop at this point. As soon as you ask them for income, they turn off, they walk away, right? That's why you want to do this at the end. Also, you don't want to prime people to think about their gender when answering the question, right? So the scenario sort of puts people on an equal footing, that they all roughly know what you're talking about, and describes some sort of proposed change. And this can be done in all sorts of ways, depending on the issue. You can do it by text, it's a bit boring. You can show pictures, you can show maps. If you're doing it online, you can show video. That really helps, that really entices at least a certain segment of the population, turns off others. Important thing here is that what you're describing is seen as credible. So one of the most studied values ever is the accident of the Exxon Valdez. I think I spoke about this before. It was 1989, a long time ago, way before you guys were born. This big tanker owned by Exxon got into, essentially was grounded off Prince William Island, that's on the other side of Canada, and spilled essentially all of its oil into the environment, lots and lots and lots of environmental damage. And of course you can say, well, let's stop using oil, right? Problem solved. That is not credible. And definitely in 1989 this was not credible, right? Because biofuels and everything were so underdeveloped. Electric cars were history, not future, at that time. So there was no alternative to oil. So a scenario that described let's stop driving cars is just not credible, right? So what you would suggest there is to use double hulled tankers, right? That would prevent oil spills, at least at the scale. If a tanker is grounded, you would promote better piloting, right, to make sure that ships are not grounded. You would have more emergency response ships to clean up the oil before it gets onto the birds and the fish and so on and so forth. And all that would be a credible intervention. And all of these things cost money, right? And people would realize that all of these things cost money. But that is important, that the alternative is not some sort of radical pie in the sky, but is actually can reasonably expected to be implemented. And of course, you need to do this in a way that people understand. We've had this big, I don't understand what all the fuss is about. But a couple of weeks ago, there was this big storm about in the media about sewage treatment companies dumping raw water into the rivers. I actually told you this in the very beginning of the lecture series. That is what they've done, and they've done for a very long time. And now all of a sudden, they wanted to sort of regularize this and make it sort of essentially just make what is common practice, made it semi-legal, and people all of a sudden got in a puff about that. Don't swim in English water, it is not good for you. That is a message that you can get across, right? And pictures as is shown here, don't go swimming, don't go fishing, don't go sailing on this water. That is something that people understand. If you put in your survey that there's 52 mpn fecal coliform per 100 milliliters of water, that is accurate information, or would be accurate information in some conditions, but nobody understands what you're talking about, right? Because nobody thinks in terms of mpn per microliter. What does that even mean? And very few people know what the word coliform means. And you would actually have a good few people who would not know that what fecal refers to, right? It's poo. And coliform are the bacteria that come out of your butt and into the water, and it's really not good to drink that. So you need to just do these things in a way that people understand it, right? And that is the the big issue here, right? That once you have read up on this material, you are an expert, right? Or somewhat of an expert. And you tend to think in these terms and you know what this means. But the people you interview don't, right? And it's them that need to answer the question, not you. And they need to understand the question, not you. You need to be neutral in the way you describe things. You need to frame these things in a way that you don't steer the answer, right? You can sort of like talk about fluffy little bar lamps will be senselessly slaughtered, right? So you put in emotive language and you immediately say it will be senseless, right? There is no purpose for their killing. So you framed it in a way that is not neutral, and you also put immediately sort of like, yeah, we should care about these because they're so cute, right? And you can also frame this and phrase this in a much more neutral way. Terribly important. Now, how are we going to pay? And this is the core question, right? How much are you willing to pay? And this influences the results, or potentially influences the results as well. And there's all sorts of ways that you can pay for this. It can be through general taxation, income taxes, for instance, which is great for students, right? Because your income is so low that you don't pay any income taxes. So you would be willing to pay much more because somebody else is paying the taxes, right? So that's an important thing to keep in mind. Income taxes is different than value-added taxes, right? You can also pay for this thing by raising excise and VAT, and then all of a sudden everybody's paying. And you would elicit different responses through this. If you do this in the United States, and you say we're going to raise taxes, then the answer is no, right? We don't want to pay more tax. So there's also social attitudes that are very different in different populations and in different parts of the population to the word tax. So an alternative is to increase the price through bill surcharges. For instance, if you're talking about greener electricity, you can pay for this by paying more for your power. Again, you would have a different target population, you would have different resistance to this. You can be asking, if we're talking about nature reserves, you could ask about an entrance fee, which may be a fair way of paying it because it's only the people who use it would pay for it. So you say, well, this is the right way of framing this question. The problem with entrance fees is that they immediately create this picture of there being a gate and a fence. And you may object to the fence being there and the gate being there because you don't like the sight of them, or you may want animals to float freely in and out of your park, right? So you can talk about parking charges instead as a way of paying for whatever you're proposing. Parking charges immediately evoke the methods of we're coming here by car, right? Some people may object to the driving of cars, and of course immediately those who come by bike or those who come by bus don't pay the parking fee, right? So this choice of how are we actually going to pay steers your answers into a particular direction, right? So it's very important to carefully consider this. It's of course also important, and I'll get back to that, whether you're talking about a one-off payment or a monthly payment or a yearly payment, right? An important thing here is that you make it clear that this is not a voluntary contribution, right? Because after all, we are typically talking about some form of externality or some form of public good, and therefore you cannot rely on voluntary payments. So, how would you do it? The oldest method is open-ended. How much are you willing to pay for a box of cornflakes? The problem is that people never thought about this. And definitely if you ask a question, how much are you willing to preserve, or how much are you willing to reduce antibiotics in the production of dairy and meat, people have never thought about this, what would be the right price. They never thought what is the right scale of payment here. If it is 10p per gallon of milk or 10p per pint of milk, is that the right amount? Does that actually buy us a lot of antibiotic reduction? People would have no clue what is a fair amount, right? Absolutely no clue. Maybe you guys know. I would not know how much 10p per pint of milk would buy you. So, don't do that, right? This is what people used to do in the 70s, but not anymore. To guide people towards reasonable numbers, you can give them a payment ladder or a payment card, where essentially you show them a menu of prices and they say, well, this seems to be reasonable. The big problem with this is now you're suggesting what is reasonable, right? And you introduce anchoring bias. Because now you are making a suggestion to them. And people may just follow a heuristic here. There's some people who always go for the cheapest, there's some people who always go for the most expensive. And most people will go a number somewhere in the middle. It's probably a good price quality thing. So you're steering people towards a certain answer. So neither is ideal. I don't know why these two appear together. An alternative would be to go for dichotomous choice, which is essentially a referendum. Are you prepared to pay 10p per pint of milk, yes or no? And that seems to work. The problem with dichotomous choice is that you need much more data. And of course you need to vary within your sample, right? Some you give 5p, some you give 10p, some you give 15p, and you see how does the probability of answering yes change with the price. A good thing about dichotomous choice is that it's a referendum format. People are very used to answering this sort of questions, right? So that takes away a lot of issues. The problem is that you just need loads and loads of data. So people have now typically go for trichotomous choice, where the first question is, are you willing to pay 10p per liter of milk? Yes or no? And if you say yes, then the second question comes, are you also willing to pay 15 pence per liter of milk? And then the answer is yes or no. And if they said no to the 10p, you go back to them and say, what about 5p, right? And then you need less data, because you have more bounds, you have more numbers, you have more information per interviewee. Now, of course, you can extend this to dichotomous choice, right? This is in Greek, so you need to learn how to count in Greek. Tessa is 4 in Greek, so you can ask a follow-up question to this, right? Somewhere between 10 and 15, 12 and a half. And presumably you can do this, well, I've seen that people do this up to 5 nests. And after that, people, it's another thing to keep in mind, after that people get fed up with you keep on asking variants on the same question, right? And they walk away from your survey. So all those things are things you can do. Now we see these things. So let's look at a case study to make these things a little bit more concrete, right? And we're going to look at Stonehenge, or rather, we're not going to value Stonehenge, we're going to value the roads around Stonehenge. And this is a study that was done by my old friend David Madison of Birmingham University. So this is the current situation. So you see Stonehenge here. My mouse is on this screen, not on this screen. And the screen is physically to my left, but computer-wise to my right. So you see Stonehenge here, and then you have these two roads that you may have driven on. If you're going to Devon or Cornwall or places like that, or you're going to the big music festival whose name now escapes me, goddammit. So you may have just been to Stonehenge to see it, right? So you have the visitor park, the visitor entrance, and the car park of Stonehenge. It's all pretty ugly. And the suggestion, and now my mouse needs to go back to my actual screen. God damn it. I'm not going to do this anymore because this is not going to work. I lost my mouse. Okay, here's my mouse. And this is what the new situation would look like, right? That you put the road A344 and the road A303 underground. And now Stonehenge looks much more natural. And the car park you also put underground. And definitely I would think that a picture to the right is the preferable one. But who am I, right? This is not about my preferences. It's not about the preferences of the analyst. It's about the preferences of the people. Costs of all this is slightly older stuff, would be 125 million. One problem with the proposal is that you can no longer see Stonehenge from the road. Benefits is that traffic would be faster, as people no longer slow down to have a good look at Stonehenge. Fewer accidents, lower operating costs. The visitors to Stonehenge would no longer be disturbed by the noise and by the cars passing by roads, so their experience goes up, and the landscape would look a lot more natural. There's very little natural landscape, and recent archaeological evidence suggests that Stonehenge in the Neolithic looked very different than what it does now, right? Stonehenge was just the center, and there were monuments, Neolithic monuments, all over the place. And Stonehenge was just a small part of the complex. But people would sort of get a feel, now really back in the Stone Age, right? Because there's no cars anymore. So yeah, it would really improve the experience of the people there. The scenario described is as I showed before. So you show the pictures as well as the text, right? This picture shows the current situation with Stonehenge in between two busy roads, blah 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 blah. And then you show them the alternative. It would look much better. Roads have gone underground, and so on and so forth, right? So this is how you would describe it. And then you ask them about which do you actually prefer, and then in this particular study they show them a payment ladder. And here you see the payment ladder. Essentially you give them options from 50p to £200. So there's very little anchoring going on, right? You give from a very wide range, and then they say, I'm willing to pay £3 in this case, but not more, definitely not more than £10. And this would be a tax that is otherwise not specified, is how they did it. So they didn't say this is an income tax or a VAT, they just said this is a tax that you would pay per year. Because it's not specified, the suggestion here that it's a poll tax, right? Everybody would pay £3 or £5 per year. Now, poll taxes have a history in England, right? This is what brought the Thatcher government down. Poll taxes are extremely unpopular, and the reason is that everybody pays the poll tax, not just the people with incomes pay the poll tax, but students pay poll tax, and retired people pay poll taxes, and rich people pay the same amount as poor people. So this may have triggered some political protest, right? But that's how they did it, right? And then questions follow up. Why did you say 0? My household cannot afford to pay. Or I actually like the roads there. Or I think the government should spend money on other things. This is not a priority. Or, and this is of course an answer that you get frequently in these sort of surveys, I think the government should pay for this. The government doesn't have any money, guys. The government only has the money that it gets in tax. Government has only the money that we give the government. It doesn't have its own sources of income. Or there may just be protest against taxation, right? So that is important to follow up. Why did you say this, right? Or why did you say 0? Do you not care about Stonehenge? Well, I may care about Stonehenge, but I may not care for taxes, right? The answers were for the status quo, and this is a surprising, somewhat surprising answer, that people who preferred to keep things as they were nonetheless prepared to pay £2.69 to keep it that way. So there is an attachment to these roads, and they're actually prepared to pay a tax not to do anything. Slightly inconsistent, right? Because it doesn't cost anything, but they were nonetheless willing to pay. That said, the 45% that did prefer to pay for the tunnel were prepared to pay on average £8.90 per year. And the main motivation for this is essentially a bequest value. We want to keep Stonehenge so that our grandchildren can see Stonehenge. That was the main reason that people were willing to pay, according to the follow-up survey that came out. So this is not a use value, right? This is not about them going to see Stonehenge. This is about the existence of Stonehenge. This is about future generations enjoying Stonehenge. And there's no way you can get this with travel cost or something like that, right? Then, if we add it all up, then people were prepared to pay 114. No, that's the difference, right? Add it all up, 114. So that's how much people are willing to pay. So the total willingness to pay for the scheme was 180 million. But then there was also people who said, no, I'm actually going to suffer a welfare loss if this is going to happen, because I don't like driving in tunnels, because I like to look at Stonehenge from the road. And those people are actually going to lose out 66 million in total. So the net welfare gain is 114 million, right? And recall that the price of the whole thing was 125. So the recommendation is this is a net welfare loss. Right. So some of these things I've hinted at already. There's a million things that can go wrong in these studies. And I'm going to talk about them at some length. There's various ways of actually testing whether something did what it was supposed to do. And the first is so-called face validity. Does it actually do what it intends to do? And it's very easy when you think back of Stonehenge to think that that 114 million is the value of Stonehenge. That is not true, right? That is not what the questions were about. The questions were about improving the area around, some would say improving, some would say making it worse, the area around Stonehenge. This is not about Stonehenge itself, but it is about the roads around Stonehenge, right? It's very important to make the distinction there. Stonehenge is not worth 114 million pounds. It's presumably worth much more than that, right? And of course, the values that were estimated are the values of the people in, I believe it was England and Wales that were surveyed, right? So it's not the larger population. Second, and for academics very important, criterion validity. Is this actually state-of-the-art methods? People outside academia don't care about this, but academics do. Does it follow best practice? A third form of validity results is construct validity. And it can be convergent or divergent. If we measure the same thing in different ways, do we actually get the same results? Or, and I'll get back to that, if we measure something differently, do we get a different result, right? And that turns out to be very, very important in contingent valuation. I'll get back to that. Compatibility with theory. Do the results actually make sense? Are your predictions correct here? One test would be here, are richer people prepared to pay more for this? Theory predicts yes, that the income elasticity is positive. And if you find that is not the case, does this actually make sense? One of the things that, going back to the payment vehicle, that people have found is that when you split the sample by something that doesn't matter theoretically, you should not get different results. And this is a study in one of the Baltic countries, I forget which, let's say it's Lithuania, where they found that there was a survey about how much are you willing to pay to clean up the Baltic, and they found very substantial difference between the ethnic Lithuanians in Lithuania and the ethnic Russians in Lithuania. And then they did the same study in Poland, and they found very significant difference between the ethnic Lithuanians and the ethnic Poles. And it doesn't make any sense. There's absolutely no reason why Lithuanians would care more or less about something than Russians. All people, right? The same is true for Poles and Lithuanians. And strikingly, the Lithuanians in Lithuania were prepared to pay much more than the Lithuanians in Poland. That doesn't make any sense, right? Theoretically, this has nothing to do with ethnicity, or in this case, it's not even ethnicity. You're not from Lithuania, are you? There's nothing to do with nationality or ethnicity. I mean, genetically, these populations are very, very close. It turned out that, following up, and that this had to do with trust in government, because the payment vehicle was that we're going to give money to the government, and the government is going to do good with the money that we've just given the government. And the Lithuanians in Lithuania trusted their government, but the Russians in Lithuania did not trust the Lithuanian government, and the Lithuanians in Poland did not trust the Polish government, but the Poles in Poland did, right? So really what they were soliciting here was, do people trust their government? Not what is their true value for cleaning up the Baltic, that was very much distorted by, do we think the government will do any good with the taxes that we give them? Right? So you need to test and find something. Does this make sense, or does this imply that we measured something differently than we thought we measured? And then finally, test and retest reliability. And essentially, if you go back and do the same thing a year later, do we actually find the same result? Yes or no, right? So those are the things we can do to test whether our results actually make sense or not. My computer has gone back to sleep. So what can go wrong? The most important thing is you're putting people in a hypothetical situation. And sort of the dismissive response to contingent valuation is that if you ask a hypothetical question, you get a hypothetical answer. There's no skin in the game, right? You're not actually being asked to pay. You're just being asked, would you pay? That may distort behavior. And of course, because there is no skin in the game, you actually don't use a lot of your brain power to give the true answer. It's purely hypothetical anyway. So there was one study where the interviewers were parked near the entrance of a castle, and they interviewed people as they went in. How much would you want to pay as an entrance fee to go visit this castle, right? Some people said, £2 is the right number, and other people say £1, and some people are particularly enthusiastic and say, I'll pay £5 as an entrance fee. And then the survey continued, and where are you from, and how old are you, and all those sort of things. And then at the end of the interview, they actually offered an entrance ticket at the price that was just stated, right? So 10 minutes ago, 5 minutes ago, they said, I'm willing to pay £2 per person to get into this castle. And then at the end of the interview, the interviewer pulled out a ticket, an entrance ticket, and say, here you go, £2 please. 43% of people in that survey said, no, I did not really mean it. Right? That's how hypothetical bias works. So some people had a good reason to refuse this ticket, right? They sort of said, well, it's a lot bigger than we thought it was, and it's late in the afternoon, we'll come back tomorrow, and tomorrow we'll pay the £2. But 43% of people said, nah, I lied to you 5 minutes ago, right? And this is, and there's nothing you can do around this, really. You can sort of alleviate this by giving people time to think. And this comes at a real cost, right? Because the longer you tie up your interviewees, the sicker they get of you. You can split it over 2 days, right? I'm going to tell you today, and I'm going to call you back tomorrow. That's painful, right? You can, in a live interview on the street, you can give them time to discuss with their family, to consult with the other people in their party. You can remind them of their budget constraint, and so on and so forth. If it's a mail-in survey, you can sort of like drop it off and give them 2 weeks to respond. The problem is that then people forget, and so on and so forth. You can try, and this is something that is increasingly common, you can do a stated preference and a revealed preference on the same thing. It doesn't apply to everything. And then sort of come up with what is the average size of the stated preference bias. You can show them cheap talk scripts, right? To show that just make the questionnaire longer, or you make the interview longer, but you throw in language such as studies have shown that people answering such surveys such as this often say they're willing to pay more than they actually would if the situation was real and this amount of money was actually had to be handed over, right? To remind them that please consider, and so on and so forth. But you can't get away from the fact that it is hypothetical and we're not talking about real money and we're not talking about a real situation. You can alleviate these concerns, but you can never take them away. And then there are all sorts of other things that can go wrong. Typically what you find in these things is lots and lots of protest votes. People say 0, go away you, I don't like you, or I don't like paying more taxes, or I don't like more government control, or I don't like something. You always find a fair share of interviewers who simply refuse to pay because they object to something that you do. One problem that is particularly important for open-ended questions is strategic bias. Because it's hypothetical, because you're not putting your money on the table, people begin to reason, right? People are social animals. As soon as you sort of confront them with a question, they do not answer the question, but they sort of begin to behave strategically and wonder, like, why did they ask this question, and why is this person here asking me questions, and what are they going to use this for? And some people cop on and say, well, they're not asking for my money, but they're interviewing 1,000 people and I'm just one of 1,000, and then they're going to take this survey to the government and ask the government to pay, and then the costs are really spread over everybody, not just me, and I really care about this, so I'm going to give a high number so that the average goes up. It's not my willingness to pay, but I think that other people are assholes, so I'm going to give a high number so that the average goes up, right? You definitely see behavior like that. And it's particularly if you use payment letters, people just stick the highest number, or if you give open-ended questions, then this definitely happens. Of course, it also happens the other way, right? There may also be a share, a fraction of the people that answer very low because they think the exact opposite, right? Using dichotomous choice or trichotomous choice basically gets around this. But with dichotomous choice and trichotomous choice, you have starting point bias. You started with 10p per liter. So you need then to split your sample where you have different starting points to see whether it matters, right? Similarly, if you give a payment letter, you have a lower point and a higher point, and you introduce anchoring problems. There's other problematic issues here, particularly if you do live interviews. People may respond to the interviewer rather than to the survey, right? So if you do this on the street, lots of young guys in the audience, if a pretty girl walks up to you and say, how much are you willing to pay to reduce antibiotics in milk? You're not thinking, right? You're not thinking she's asking me about antibiotics. No, you think she's green, I'm going to try and impress her, right? By giving a high answer, right? It doesn't work, guys. She's just there to earn some money. She's not really interested in this. Alternatively, if somebody walks up to you with very bad breath and start asking these questions, your response is, go away, man. Right? So interviewer bias is very important in all this. I have taught this class for a very long time, including in a class in Hamburg where we had a lot more time to do this, and actually we had a a practical where they actually went out and studied the value of water quality in one of the lakes in Hamburg. And then we ran the regressions, and the only thing that popped up significant in the regression was the interviewer ID. That was the only thing that explained the results. People responded to the interviewer, not to the questions. And this can go very, 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 very wrong. Two examples from the medical literature. One example from the medical literature and one example from the education literature. When they studied the prevalence of AIDS in rural Kenya, ask questions about their sexual behavior and so on and so forth, and their drug use is different there. So it was mostly about sexual behavior, and of course you immediately have protests, right? Who are you asking? A stranger comes knocking on my door and starts asking me about my sex life? Yeah, as if I'm going to answer those questions truthfully, right? But it was a detailed medical survey, and they actually asked to take blood. Now, if an interviewer comes to my door and says, "Can I take some of your blood?" Then I would not be too impressed. And the same problem popped up here, and then when they tested, and so some interviewers actually got a good bit of blood out of their interviewees. And then when they tested these things, two problems popped up. One interviewer was particularly smart and got the blood of a cow instead of blood of the interviewees. None of the cows had any AIDS, so that was good. Another interviewer, everybody in his sample had AIDS. And that was because it turned out that he was too shy to ask people for blood, so he took his own, right? And interviewers are paid very well on Kenyan terms. He did not know he had AIDS, but he knew now, right? So all sorts of things can go wrong here. I promise you two examples. An old friend of mine used to do these sort of things to make a little bit of money in college, and this was about the education of ethnic minorities in the Netherlands. So she went to people's houses, people from a Turkish background or a Moroccan background or a Surinamese background, and asked them to solve simple mathematical problems, summation or addition, those sort of things. But she was a very nice girl, right? So when people could not solve these simple arithmetic problems, she helped them and found very wrong answers as a result, right? So all sorts of things can go wrong if you're not careful with your interviewers. The alternative is, of course, then to go to mail-in surveys, telephone surveys, online surveys, but that creates all sorts of other problems. Like online surveys, everybody sees the same thing, so you don't have interviewer bias, but online surveys tend to be filled in not by the very old, because they're not very computer literate, not by the very busy, because they tend to ignore this, right? So you get a very skewed part of the population. I talked about yay saying and nay saying already, right? If the pretty girl walks up to you, you say yay. Prominence bias and information bias are also important. You walk up to somebody and you ask them about antibiotics in milk. They have never thought about this before, right? So immediately, by telling them that this is a problem, the people you asked know more about this, your sample is better informed than the general population. And you immediately start to color their knowledge. And you make it more important to them, right? You just reminded them of this particular problem. This problem that they have ignored for most of the year now is fresh in their minds, right? And therefore that may color the answers that you get. So all that is important. Non-response bias I talked about. Some people tend to respond, some people do not. And then there is the whole issue that I promised to talk about, part-whole bias, temporal embedding, sequence effects adding up. It's all part of the same thing. And the best example comes out of a study that they did in Louisiana. And this is again part of the Exxon-Valdez series of studies where so this is where they produce oil, and some of the oil just sits in oil palms, just a lake of oil essentially, near where they get oil out of the ground. And it's Louisiana, so there's lots of migratory birds, and birds are particularly stupid. They sort of like see something on the surface and they think this is water, and they land in a pool of oil and then they die, right? So this is a particular problem there. And the question is, what can you do about that? And one of the things that you could do about this is put nets over these oil palms, right? To make sure that birds can't get in. And that obviously costs money. So they did this survey of how much are you willing to pay for this. And in one scenario, they would save 300,000 birds every year. In another scenario, a third of the population or the sample, they saved 3 million birds per year. And in the third part, they saved only 30,000 birds per year. And then the question is, how much are you willing to pay? And lo and behold, the answer was $20, Louisiana. Regardless of whether that $20 per person would save 30,000 or 300,000 or 3 million ducks per year. And this is known as the part-whole bias. And you see very similar things if you ask people how much are you willing to pay per month versus per year. You get the same answer, 20. And 20 per month really is 12 times more as 20 per year. And you would see the same thing if you ask people sort of sequencing, are you willing to pay a little bit to solve this specific environmental problem, or are you willing to pay to solve a much larger environmental problem? People seem not to be able to relate the size of what they're hypothetically buying with how much they are willing to pay. And there's a large literature on this. Part-whole bias, scope insensitivity, temporal embedding, sequence effects, adding up problem. It's all the same phenomenon. That what we expect from microtheory is that if you get more, you should be willing to pay more, right? You should be willing to pay more for 2 boxes of cornflakes than for 1 box of cornflakes. You should actually be willing to pay roughly double. But that is not what you find. And there are 2 explanations for this, and both are worrisome. One is the so-called warm glow effect, and that is that people don't buy the environmental good, but people buy warm glow. And the sort of behavioral explanation here is that the way people think is there's lots of misery in the world. I don't want to think about all that misery, right? Because that just makes me miserable. But I do want to help solve it, so I have a budget of a charitable budget of £500 per year. Or in your case, it may be £50 a year, right? This is how much I'm going to give this year to charity. Last year, 10 people knocked on my door for a contribution. So this year, I'm going to give £5 to every charitable organization that comes and asks for my money. And then I don't have to think about this, right? Then it's gone. I've done my bit in solving it, and I don't want to think about it. And people interpret then a contingent valuation study as just another charitable contribution, and they fix the budget in their heads. It's £5. And they just don't engage with the problem at all, right? And really what they're buying is some sort of moral assurance, something that makes them feel good. I've done my bit for charity again. And really you're buying internal satisfaction. And in the literature this is known as the warm glow that you get when you do something good. So that is one explanation, and that immediately means that the values that you get are completely unrelated to the things that you want to value, right? You always get the same number. The other explanation, and this is a more recent one, is that people can't count or won't count. That if you're talking about ducks, people really count as 1, 2, 3, 6 many, and 30,000 ducks is the same as 300,000 ducks. And I would actually challenge you to tell the difference between 30,000 ducks and 300,000 ducks. It's just an enormous amount of ducks, right? And this is now being formalized by people like my colleague Pavel, who you may have met. Yeah, he's been around for a while. He teaches math, right? It's just noticeable differences. That people don't really count large numbers and small changes in large numbers. It's all just the same, right? And these are big challenges to contingent valuation studies. So I'm definitely not going to get to willingness to pay versus willingness to accept. That's next term. I have 15 minutes left for choice modeling. Now, I've given you the basic difference already. Choice modeling, the design, much the same as for contingent valuation. You need to do your homework, you need to test, and so on and so forth. The big difference is that rather than asking people how much are you willing to pay for this discrete purchase, you ask people to choose. And this comes natural. I gave you the example of cornflakes in the supermarket. This is what you saw 2 years ago when I prepared this slide. If you go to Amazon and you're trying to buy a new phone, you pick one, and then at the bottom it gives you options of phones that are these. You can't get these anymore, all off the market. Phones that are comparable, different sizes, different shapes, different prices, different speeds, different connectivity, and so on and so forth. This is what you're used to. This is how you shop for things. Right? This is a very familiar thing for the human brain. And contingent choice is essentially the same thing. You ask people to choose. Would you rather have wave energy, or I shouldn't point at my screen, if you rather have wave energy, offshore wind, onshore wind, and it looks different. We have a picture immediately. It also means that the price of electricity goes up by 80 pounds in 2 scenarios, or by 40 pounds in the third scenario. Onshore wind is a lot cheaper than offshore wind. And you would obviously do it in different places. Onshore wind would be, this is a study from Scotland as you may have guessed, would be on land. Offshore would be at sea, right? So it looks different, it affects different people and different wildlife. And then also, and you may not have noticed this, and this is a big problem in this particular example, there's impacts on wildlife. It's maybe negative or positive or neutral. And then at the very bottom you have, no, I would not like any of this, right? And then you ask people, which of these 4 alternatives do you like best? This comes much more natural to people, right? Than the question, how much are you willing to pay for wind energy? And of course, you show them various scenarios, right? You don't ask this question once, but you may ask them 4 or 5 times. And then you and you show different alternatives to different part of your sample, different combinations of alternatives, and then you gather information about their preferences. And the way these things are set up is that you have different options or different alternatives, different scenarios. It always includes the status quo option, right? Must include the status quo option, and has different attributes. Wildlife, visual amenity, price has to be there because we're trying to put a price tag on things, right? So you have to have some sort of pounds in there somewhere. And that is how you do it. Of course, you don't show this to your audience, you show this. Now, the one of the problems with this particular design is that the wildlife is not very prominent. I actually needed to tell you there is wildlife here. Your eyes are immediately drawn to the visual amenities and to the location. But there's also a row about wildlife here, right? So this is a badly designed study, and this is actually an actual study that was done for the Scottish government, and really the consultants should be ashamed of themselves, right? Because really the unsuspecting interviewee would have missed the wildlife impact, or would have gathered wildlife is actually not that important, right? You give a large amount of space to visual amenities, a large amount of space to location, but a tiny amount of space to wildlife can't be important, right? So badly designed. So design issues are important here. The good thing, as I said, is that this is much more familiar. You diffuse the cost focus, so you would have far fewer protest votes. You're asked to choose between an option, so you're not seduced to say yes because you like things, or say nay because you don't like things. You're actually much more likely just to state your preferences. The problem, and I pointed out one problem already, is that you need to design this very carefully. And in the thing we just showed, the wildlife sort of gets drowned by the other things. So that is a problem. The other big issue that has shown up in practical applications of this is it is actually cognitively burdensome for your interviewees. I need to consider many options and many attributes, and people just give up. And recall, it's still all hypothetical, right? So we're not talking about how are you going to do things in your back garden, and then you have a real incentive to get it right. Oh, we're talking about hypothetical stuff that may happen far away from where I live and then may never bother me, right? So people may not be willing to invest the time to do this carefully. And what you see is that some people just go for heuristics, that they only answer about the price and ignore the rest, or people just get annoyed with this and just say, I always pick the left option, right? So you see indeed behavior like this. You gather enough data that you can actually sort of filter out those, and I mean those who always pick the left option, it becomes pretty obvious, right? Those who only consider the price, for instance, and ignore all the other information, if you carefully set up which alternatives are shown, that is also revealed in the data, right? That there's certain options that simply never occur to them, that never seem to influence their behavior, that actually shows up in their behavior. You want to be very fancy, and you get people into the lab, or nowadays also on a computer, you can actually, sometimes, you can monitor where their eyes are on the screen. You need to ask people to turn on the camera. And you can always sort of look at keyboard strokes and mouse movements, right? Somebody who's really looking at different things, sort of like puts his mouse there, and then there, and then there, really looking at things, whereas other people go through it very, very quickly, right? So actually, with modern survey technologies, you can actually pick out a whole lot of this stuff. And then of course the question comes, so what do I do with these respondents? Do I ignore them? Do I give them less weight? Do I report them separately? That is then an important question in the analysis. The analysis of the data is very much as with the travel calculator, right? Essentially, you've asked people to choose between discrete alternatives, and just as you ask people about discrete visits to different parks, this is essentially another random utility model, right? So the econometrics of this we talked about last week, so that is good. So that leaves me 5 minutes to show you one particular case study, and then I'll shut up. And that is about people's willingness to pay to offset the CO2 emitted when they choose to take a flight. And this is a study that was done by the guy who used to teach this course, George McCarran, as part of his PhD. And published now 12 years ago. And it was a choice experiment, and it looked something like this. Carbon offset, yes or no. The status quo is to the very right. And different carbon offsets, stuff that was focused on nature conservation and biodiversity, or stuff that is focused on human development. Are these offsets certified by an independent organization or not at all, or by the UK government? And then of course the price. Are you willing to pay for a flight to New York? I believe this was £8 extra, yes or no? And the two projects, offset projects A and B, cost the same price, and of course if you're not willing to pay, then it's zero. And just a range of these questions, right? That tells you something about that. And then you can just stick it in a regression and find all sorts of things. Yes, people are prepared to pay for this. So the way these numbers read, the 3.1 is the average willingness to pay per ton of CO2, and then the 0.69 that you immediately see behind it is the standard error of this estimate. So this is significant, people are prepared to pay for this. And then the standard deviation that you see below this goes back to the remark that I made previously. If you want to get this published, you need to do fancy econometric things and stuff and fancy survey designs. Is the heterogeneity in the population, right? So the 3.1 is the average willingness to pay, which is significant, but it varied with a standard deviation within the population by a very significant amount. So some people, some 5% of the people, were prepared to pay 3.1 plus 2 times 6, were willing to pay £15. 95% of people, or 5% of the people, were prepared to pay more than £15 for this, right? That is what the second number means. And then you also find certification is important to people. The price is obviously price elasticity is negative. People were prepared to pay slightly more for biodiversity conservation than for something that helped people with their livelihoods, right? So all these things pop out, and then the good thing about this is, of course, that you then also have a follow-up survey, which in this case included open-ended questions like why did you say this and why do you think this is important, and the good thing then is that you also get a sense of not just the average but also of the heterogeneity. I talked a little bit about that, but also why people say this, and these were some of the remarks that were left in this. And some people say, these carbon offsets, it sounds like a scam, right? They're just taking money of us, not going to do anything. Other people had a more fundamental objection: we should not be flying at all, it's bourgeois. Another protest vote: let's all fly more to do more good. You disgust me. So that's the sort of thing, if you've met George, this would be wholly unfair. But of course also people who were rather on the green side: we must fight for the penguins, and so on and so forth. It's an emergency, we must act. And if I don't do my bit, I can't blame others for not doing theirs when the ice cap melts. So you also get a sense of why people answered the questions, why people gave the answers that they did. So much for today.